back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kaligan here with another packed week of World War III analysis. There is a lot going on, specifically in the Holy Land, of course, but also in Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan. We're going to bring you updates on the Bulgarian patriarchal elections, which are going to have a big impact on world orthodoxy, as well as some other things going on in the Balkans. But of course, we are going to start in the Holy Land. But before we dive into that, of course, Dimitri, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. There's been a lot of news from the Middle East, from the Levant, specifically from Lebanon and Israel on the northern border. Last week, naturally, we had that massive breakthrough in Rafah. In a negative sense, the pier has stopped. The construction of the pier has stopped. So definitely big developments in the south. But this week, I think the focus very much is on that Hezbollah Israeli IDF front, wherein the bombing hasn't ceased. The fires still rage on amongst the trees of that sort of biblical landscape, and just north of the Sea of Galilee, in the mountains there, and even around Haifa as well. The bombardment of Hezbollah, of Israeli targets, military, and some of the strikes are falling on civilian targets. But this is just what happens in war, as we've seen in Russia and Ukraine recently. It's somewhat unavoidable, especially in a conflict against between two parties which are essentially not equal in strength. And you can see Hezbollah in Nasrallah's recent speech, which I think we'll recite a couple of times, or at least make reference to. Nasrallah did state that Hezbollah has at least 100,000 fighters ready to go, and that they're ready to, even in the worst of circumstances, which I'm not sure what he's referencing, perhaps an invasion of Lebanon outright by Israeli troops. He's stating that Hezbollah is ready to defend Lebanon and also ready to assist the Palestinian people. And so on the ground, I think Hezbollah is in fact preparing and has been preparing its defenses since I think 2006 or so, which, if you think about it, looking at the Ukrainian defenses in the Donetsk region, if we can make that slight comparison, Ukraine had 8 years to prepare certain defensive structures, concrete bunkers, modernized trench systems, minefields, things like that against the Russians, 8 years or so. Here we have, more than, close to 2 decades, at least since 2006, since the previous Lebanese-Israeli war. And so Lebanon has been preparing, or, Hezbollah, as the representatives of the southern Lebanese people, have been preparing their country for an imminent invasion as soon as they would overstep. And I think that they have overstepped recently in terms of what has been permitted by the Israeli overlords in the south, because they're definitely the masters of the region. They do have the planes, they do have the capacity to shut down essentially the Lebanese military, and the only way you can really resist them is to face them head first. And I think the news we're seeing, right? I think this is probably the biggest story, is that recently the Israeli officials have warned, and I think this warning is more of a call to help to the US, to various Israeli allies. They're saying that the various power grids, especially in the north of Israel, are not prepared for the war of Hezbollah. The Hezbollah strikes on these civilian targets may in fact shut down the country's power infrastructure. So the CEOs of these private, slightly private, perhaps even public companies like the Israeli Electric Company are already complaining and making these complaints public, essentially crying out for help. Not crying out as they strike you, but crying for help as as they're being bombed by Hezbollah, which is very curious because it does show a certain amount of victimhood by the Israelis. At least they're not really showing strength here, right? They're almost complaining. And Netanyahu's recent video, I think, speaks to that, Conrad. We're speaking about the 1 minute or so video wherein he essentially asks Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of the US under the Joe Biden administration, asks him, states very clearly that Anthony Blinken is basically the APAC handler for Israel, if on an official scale, and he is representing Netanyahu, the Israeli government, and he's attempting to procure more aid for Israel from the US, because US aid has stopped kind of flowing in ever since we had those last F-16 parts as well as F-16 planes. I believe it was in March of this year, because again, the situation in Gaza has escalated to such an extent that, of course, the US looks bad on paper, even supporting Israel. And this is the last point I want to make, Conrad, before we can kind of look more deeply at these details, is that notice in this contrast. So if Israel, again, focuses strictly on Hamas and Gaza, and of course the alleged Palestinian terrorists, then in fact the US looks very bad on an international scale. Nobody is willing to support Israel. And even the US, Joe Biden, is kind of hesitant in supporting the Israeli administration. Whilst if Israel fights say Hezbollah, who are even on paper there is clear sort of evidence tying them to Iran, another US enemy, and it looks more like a proper war as opposed to an actual genocide of, say, the local people of Gaza, then perhaps the US would be more willing to again bring those aircraft carriers a little bit closer, support Israel a bit more, perhaps even begin to supply Israel with allegedly and apparently much needed weapons. And it's surprising because we all thought Israel was very much a self sustaining sort of country that had stockpiles of weapons, but it seems like, based on Netanyahu's 1 minute complaint video to the Biden administration, that perhaps Israel is running out of weapons, or maybe they just weren't preparing as seriously as they should have been.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Nasrallah talking about the 100,000 troops. It seems that Hezbollah is definitely preparing for what appears to be an inevitable Israeli invasion. The U.S. is even talking about how they're preparing to help Israel do that because I think they've realized that that's the only way they're going to get them to tone down what's going on in Gaza and go with the ceasefires because they need to get redirected north to fight against Hezbollah and perhaps even other forces in Lebanon. Who knows what forces will enter the Golan Heights from Syria or something if this does happen. A lot of possibilities for broader expansion going on here, similar situations in Ukraine, of course. But one of these particular opportunities for expansion is into Cyprus, as Nasrallah recently said, we have intel that the Israeli Air Force is training in Cyprus to use its airports. We warn Cyprus if it opens the airports to Israel during a potential war, we will treat it as a part of the war. And in response to this, Cyprus stopped issuing visas to Lebanese citizens. Apparently, hotel cancellations are way up in Cyprus, and Cyprus basically responded saying that they're not going to participate in any kind of Israeli operation. And then Nasrallah was like, well, those are words. We'll see your actions. So, this is, Cyprus, that kind of big permanent aircraft carrier off the coast of Israel. Obviously, there's UK bases on there. There's the Greeks who are NATO members, and the other side of it, northern Cyprus, unrecognized, but basically just Turkish occupied territory. So very much NATO territory, Cyprus, right off the coast. So that's quite interesting. Who knows how that'll fare into some prophecies? Because we know, there will be a few days of tension on Cyprus with things going on, but ultimately, Metropolitan Novidos has said that there won't be any actual fighting, or that even the Turkish soldiers will have to actually leave Cyprus. But I mean, who knows? There have been recent articles about how apparently northern Cyprus is becoming a hotbed of Iranian territory. I'm a bit skeptical of that, considering that it's, Turkish territory and that Azerbaijan is also very close with northern Cyprus and they're not close. But this seems to be an attempt to put Turkey, Iran, all these Islamic supporters of Palestine, put them all into, like, I guess, the same box or whatever. But who knows? Maybe Iran is making inroads in northern Cyprus, probably or possibly due to or through Hezbollah influence, because northern Cyprus, it's right there. It's Islamic. Hezbollah not far away in southern Lebanon. So, there's all sorts of possibilities. But the other big news, of course, out of Israel is Netanyahu dissolved the war cabinet. This was very much expected after Benny Gantz, who is the moderate, leader. He would have been the prime minister if, Likud hadn't always been so ascendant in its, elections, or if they hadn't had to build that super patchwork coalition government for those few years they were able to keep Netanyahu out of power. Gantz, I believe it's the Blue and White Party, is what he leads, and he left the six-person cabinet, and now Netanyahu, realizing that, the largest other partner in it was gone, dissolved the whole thing. And I don't know exactly what the plan is, because I hear that they don't want to bring in Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the hardliners, the extreme Kahanists, because of, obvious reasons how that would upset even more the Middle Eastern countries that have, turned against them. Speaking of which, Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, as his, father, the king, gets much older, he has said that it's time for a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. So calling for a two-state solution, Saudi Arabia is basically the biggest ally of Israel in the Islamic world, in the Sunni world, kind of keeping the Sunni world in their sphere against the Shia crescent that threatens them. So this is a big blow to Israel, obviously. I think MBS realized, he's savvy enough, he's probably on TikTok, he realizes that supporting Israel isn't really a viable option when you're an Islamic ruler, when you're somebody that's also trying to, present as a humanitarian. You have the whole Khashoggi thing in your rearview mirror that people are always going to kind of slander you with. So you probably are best to come out on the right side of history, as many people might say. And I mean, right now it's pretty overwhelming worldwide consensus about the situation in Gaza, who's in the wrong. And obviously, again, Mecca, Medina, all the people in Gaza are like praying that direction. This guy's gonna what support Israel, so it makes sense that MBS would do this. But I mean, obviously, it's a blow to Israel, and there's still talks that that when the war and stuff is over in Gaza or Lebanon or wherever it all goes, they will resume the conversations they were having about total rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I know the UAE totally reproached. I think the Saudis were about to follow in that direction, but then of course we had all sorts of things go on in the Middle East, October 7th being the obviously most dramatic one. So it might be, the end of the Jewish state as far as its recognition in the Islamic world, which is going to mean that they're going to be leaning on the U.S. even more, which is why I was very disappointed to see the Haaretz headline that Likud and Netanyahu are leaning all in on Trump to win, apparently, in 2024. So as I predicted, the Likudniks, the Jews, they're going to steal it for Trump, unfortunately. And despite all of the anti-Zionist energy on the right that I'm sure he is aware of, he probably is going to take the $100 million from Miriam Adelson. He probably will then greenlight West Bank annexation. And if he is the president in the midst of some catastrophic, high loss situations going on in the war between Hezbollah and Israel and Lebanon, and then Iran decides to get involved, Trump very well may be the guy to greenlight, the full-scale war that would come out of that. So very disappointing to see. It's not 100%, of course. Trump could surprise us, but that does seem to be the direction that is going. But yeah, you mentioned the grid, Dimitri. I'm wondering what that was signaling for. I don't know if that was something that the war cabinet or that Netanyahu would want broadcast, but obviously we know Netanyahu not popular. An entire massive segment of Israeli society wants him gone, but the opportunity for war in the north is going to give him the opportunity to even scale down Gaza while maintaining this, wartime situation, this state of exception that he has, been exploiting for, what'll probably be over a year before it's even wrapped up completely in Gaza. And then who knows how long it is till it's wrapped up with this new adventure in Lebanon.
Yeah, I think one of the key factors in this coming war between Hezbollah and Israel, which is already raging, by the way, and it's only going to escalate, I think, going forward, as we've discussed last week. The casualty rate, I think, on paper shows that this is a real conflict. It isn't what we saw between, say, Iran and Israel, which was essentially a show of force. But the drone element, I think, as we've seen in Russia, Ukraine, the use of drones by Iran, and now, of course, this recent footage. Briefly, I need to mention it, considering the bombardment of civilian infrastructure, because the drone footage of Haifa, which is a major port city in northwestern Israel, the importance of Haifa can't be understated in terms of Israel, of course, greatly depending on exports and imports. It is a very small country which consumes quite a bit, as you can imagine, being almost, you can say, well, pretty much a first world country in terms of consumption, energy use, things like that. And the Israeli people, in general, live a pretty lavish lifestyle. So it's very much this sort of footage of the ports of the harbors there is very menacing, showing that Hezbollah does have an eye out for this gem, which is quite vulnerable over there in northwestern Israel. Of course, the landscape is very curious because you do have Mount Carmel there, where in the Old Testament, Prophet Elijah defeated the priest of Baal, and of course slew them after the ritual, after their failed satanic ritual of trying to call down the fire, and of course failing because Baal is a false god, and naturally the valley of Megiddo. That is the book of Revelations. Armageddon is located right next to that. So, very sort of curious land, which, even if it won't be engaged in this particular war, and maybe if the Battle of Armageddon won't take place in the coming year or so, it will definitely take place, I can say, in the years to come, because that is the prophetic, I think, view of the future. So this is very apocalyptic, biblical, these particular places, so quite menacing. And of course, Haifa has that very famous Orthodox church. I visited it last time I was on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The Orthodox Church, a Rokor Moscow Patriarch. Actually, it's a Moscow Patriarch church with a lot of Rokor attendees. The Church of Saint Elijah the prophet. So very good Orthodox community in Haifa. Unfortunately, they may be also potential victims of this conflict in the coming time. So we should pray for everybody living there. What's very interesting, I think, Conrad, is this Trump MBS Netanyahu interaction, because I completely agree with you. There is this banking on Trump winning the election in November, and that perhaps changing the attention, moving it from Ukraine, moving it from these other investments, moving it, say, from Ukraine, which has been a huge money dump, to places such as Israel, and locations such as Taiwan, which we'll speak about later in the episode. I think also Trump's relationship with Saudi Arabia, which was very, very much an amicable agreement. Like we do know the huge military deal that they've struck, which is the greatest military deal I think the US has done since World War II, is I think a big step forward for that relationship. And of course, MBS I think completely understands that, and hence he's putting pressure on Netanyahu and basically is saying that, look, I'm only going to help and assist Israel in terms of only under the condition that perhaps Trump comes to power and perhaps everything is normalized here in the Middle East. And the pressure MBS is putting on Netanyahu shouldn't be like understated too. He has spoken out in favor of the ICC arrest warrants, which is very curious. So perhaps MBS is again banking on these protests in Israel to break up, and maybe Benny Gantz coming to power. Who knows, right? It's very curious that if the CIA isn't involved in local protests of any sort, such as BLM riots or events in Ukraine at the moment, where Zelensky leaves for 3 or 4 weeks and simply doesn't come back into the country, and no one really protests, nobody overthrows the Zelensky government, or in Israel where the protests have been raging for almost a year now, and still there is no current Maidan colored revolution taking place. It's because the powers that be, the powers that control the secret services around the world, or the majority of these secret services, they do not agree with the this particular idea of having a Maidan in Israel, which I think says a lot. And we do have we should note, of course, that Saudi Arabia's relationship with Yemen and the Houthis has been very tense recently. I think Saudi Arabia is greatly affected by what's happening in the southern Red Sea. So I think it's normal for MBS to reach out and sort of have proposed this Palestinian, as you said, 1967 peace borders between the Palestinian state and Israel. And so again, it's not what the Russians proposed, returning to the 1940s, but 1967 is still better than what's happening right now. And perhaps they are banking on having a peace treaty with the Houthis and the Yemenis people soon as well. So it's almost a two-way deal. Saudi Arabia greatly, of course, not only does it benefit from war in sort of local regions because it does gain territory, such as I'm sure Saudi Arabia would love to annex Yemen, but it's simply not possible at the moment. And I think the economic crisis, sort of the US petrodollar really getting hit recently with inflation and things like that, is, I think, also people paying attention to that. In terms of Trump MBS, we all remember Conrad, when Trump at one of the meetings walks by, taps MBS on the shoulder. MBS being the Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, being tapped on the shoulder like a bro by Donald Trump, as I think shows you Trump's kind of power as this charismatic leader who could perhaps bring a new order to the Middle East in a weird proto Moshiach type fashion. I think everybody really feels and understands that. So they're just waiting, I think, for the big Don to return and to set things straight. But the attention, right, kind of moves from that Hezbollah region to the Red Sea, wherein we can still see shipments greatly affected. Like we understand now, this week statistics have come out, Conrad, that the Houthis have shut down 90% of the Red Sea trade, especially that trade related to Western countries, whilst Russian ships are being allowed to travel through. And of course, certain units of the Russian Navy are also involved in sort of keeping the peace in that particular region in terms of defending the Russian vessels, and of course stopping the shenanigans of the French fleet members, the French Navy, various United States vessels from interrupting Russian shipments. So it's a really interesting relationship of the Houthis and Russia, and I think it's the Houthi members actually visiting Moscow recently, I think, has sort of cemented that relationship.
Well, it's good that you bring up the Houthis in the Red Sea, that they're totally shutting down the Red Sea. It's said that even the vast majority, 92% of oil shipments making it through the Suez Canal are of Russian origin, because the Houthis are mostly targeting Israeli, US, British, and a few other countries' ships. Obviously, the Russians are not being targeted explicitly, but the Ansar Allah commander himself, Sayyid Abdul Malik Badr al-Din al-Houthi, so the Houthi namesake himself, he had a big speech today. In the beginning of his speech, he literally says the Saudi regime is not worthy of serving the Hajj and achieving its great Quranic and Islamic purposes. So even with MBS, calling for a Palestinian state, the Houthis have been going so hard that they don't view that as nearly enough. So, they're going off on all of these things, going against all these countries that have come out against them, really, because they've maintained frame against these huge US, UK airstrikes. Their leadership is still intact, so they think that they can take on the. I mean, they kind of can. They've proven that they can, sort of. take on the world. But he takes credit for, their attacks targeting the USS Eisenhower. He talks about the sinking of that big container ship, the Tudor, which I believe was British Israeli in some capacity. We all saw the video of that. It was struck multiple times and completely sunk. So, big dramatic victory for them. And there's another ship on the verge of sinking, the Verbena, which is in the Gulf of Aden. So they've really been targeting all sorts of things, like 10 plus recent strikes. I think it's 153 total ships targeted since the beginning of their operation, their blockade and their, dedicated war against the forces that they perceive as contributing to the genocide in Gaza. So again, the Houthis are a very major force. I should stop calling them the Houthis. I should really start just calling them, the Yemeni forces, because they are the relevant forces in Yemen, and I think they've earned the title. But regardless, they are pulling up. But going a little bit south, there's also some big news from Somalia, Turkey, some situations going on there. I mentioned last week that Somalian piracy has dramatically increased because of so many of these ships that aren't going through the Red Sea because of the Houthi blockade. They're having to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, and that takes them around the long, dangerous coast of Somalia and Kenya, which, historically, we know if you've seen Captain Phillips, these other movies, they've got this piracy problem. People have since been using private security. They've got automatic weapons and stuff mounted on these ships to protect them. But a lot of these ships aren't going to have that, because why would you have that if you're just going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal? But you're going around Somalia. Suddenly, I think a lot of these Somalian pirates are like, dang, a lot of these ships don't have these defenses. Let's take them on. So we're seeing some record highs in the past years since the crisis kind of was wrapped up, decade or more or so ago at this point. So this is fascinating, but there's even more political things going on in Somalia itself.
Absolutely, yes. On the 17th of June, the Somali president Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud met with the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan in Ankara. So, actually, the Somali president traveled to Turkey itself in order to sign two deals, one of them relating to oil and gas corporation, essentially developing gas and oil exports with huge benefits going towards the Turkish side. Once these fossil fuels are actually obtained from these places where I mean Somalia has been in a state of civil war for a long time, so it really hasn't been able to exploit its natural resources. And the other deal was a really comprehensive maritime defense agreement, essentially for and not just naval but also slightly related to the navy. The thing is, I think a lot of people, and including myself, I wasn't aware until about a year ago of the camp located in Somalia. So Somalia's major base, I would say probably its most effective base is actually not Somalian. It's Camp Turksom, which, as you can imagine, it belongs to Turkey, and it was established under the Trump presidency, probably with a green light from the Trump administration, of course, through NATO. And this it's a 400-hectare camp, has over several hundred Turkish employees, probably going to the thousands. The details are quite rare because probably nobody really goes to Somalia in order to investigate, but it does train Somalian naval officers, members of the Somalian security forces, army, and so this particular camp is located on the coast as well. So they can train the young, I suppose, young Somalian navy, which aren't really involved with piracy and probably will fight against it in the near future in terms of maritime strategy and how to approach these sort of things. Interesting, Conrad, because this week we'll be talking about ships quite a bit. So it's very much a sea episode. But it's really bizarre, isn't it? Because we see, countries such as Eritrea, Djibouti hosting international sort of bases on the Red Sea, and suddenly we notice Turkey is also involved in this sort of Horn of Africa, Red Sea shenanigans area. So everybody's really invested in these underwater sea cables and these trade shipping routes. And Turkey, I mean, outstretching its hand like that, it is very Ottoman-esque, and it did take place under Erdogan's regime, so it is very recent development. So we need to keep an eye out on Somalia. Of course, Somalia is a majority Muslim country too, so we need to keep that in mind, especially with the Ethiopian recent deal with Somaliland, I guess the northwestern segment of Somalia, which has announced its personal sovereignty similar to Donetsk, Lugansk, and is now striking a deal with Ethiopia in order to, actually grant Ethiopia access to the Red Sea, not through Djibouti, which is essentially like a international multi-enterprise sort of state. Djibouti is very much like a globalist entity. I think if anyone really looks at it on the map, it's really kind of like a Guyana type situation there. But Somaliland really probably is perhaps the future of Somalia in terms of having a sovereign sort of conscientious, really wholesome country, which really isn't under the heel of the U.S. or or Turkey in this case. But yes, so Turkey is working with Somalia for whatever reason. Perhaps maybe we do know Turkey and Egypt have butted heads in the past, and Ethiopia is kind of between the two. Ethiopia is always threatening. We did speak to our good friend Dean Arnold quite a while ago on the Ethiopian issue, Conrad. And when we discussed Ethiopia's proximity to Egypt, the Great Renaissance Dam, which is of course working on the Blue Nile River, stopping and essentially pressuring Egypt quite a bit in terms of some of its agricultural needs, because we do know Egypt is, for all its value in terms of tourism, Egypt is an extremely poor country in terms of wealth, and that's quite funny because historically speaking, the amusing fact is that Egypt was always the richest province of the Roman Empire in terms of agriculture, exports, things like that. So the first and the second Rome benefited from Egypt quite dramatically, and suddenly today Egypt depends on literally the third Rome, that is Russia and Ukraine, who export 70% of Egypt's foods, especially grains, things like that, from those areas. So Egypt is attached to, via a saline drip to the Ukraine Russia region, which is highly unstable. And we do know that Russia, it's very curious because Turkey and Egypt are opposed to one another. We know the Turkish government is very much involved with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a Masonic Islamic organization. Probably don't have time to really get into the details there, but Egypt as well is on the sort of pay drip of the US. US of course subsidizing, giving Egypt money over time in order to keep the Suez Canal open, as well as supporting and not really doing anything negative, not really committing to any anti-Israeli actions there. So Egypt is in a very precarious position. Ethiopia is between them. Ethiopia as well faces major challenges. It still has a small, well, but significant civil war taking place in northern Ethiopia, which still hasn't resolved itself. And of course, it has no direct access to the Red Sea. Naturally, so it's a really contentious zone there, Conrad, I think in the northeast in Africa, which if World War III breaks out, this may be like a poorer version. Like this way, it'll probably be a lot hotter than what we saw during World War II and World War One in this region when the Italians tried to colonize Ethiopia, things like that. But we will be seeing action in this particular region of the world, and as we said, famine will be a major factor, I think, for both Somalia, Ethiopia, and Egypt when World War III breaks down and communication lines between international actors also diminish.
Well, there are many prophecies that say America will feed the world and then it itself will starve. So a lot of people are going to have to worry about famine and these sorts of things. But you're talking about this region, of course. Russia also has its impending base on the Red Sea coast of South Sudan, which is why they, of course, have and well, just in Sudan and South literal Sudan. I don't know if it's actually South Sudan, the country, but that's why the whole thing going on with the Rapid Support Forces is falling apart because it appears that Russia cut a deal with the actual president of Sudan. But you were mentioning World War III in relation to Somalia, Ethiopia, Somaliland, Egypt, Turkey. Think about the breakdown in the context of orthodoxy, right? There's word of Ethiopia allying more and more with Russia, potential. What if there was a reunion, perhaps, where they return to true orthodoxy and ally closely with Russia? Think about it. You have Turkey allying with Mogadishu, Ethiopia allying with Somaliland, securing more Red Sea access. Obviously, Russia would then side with Ethiopia against Turkey, as the prophecies, of course, predict. So it really does start to fall along the lines of things that we could see easily happening. So a very relevant part of the world for sure. Somalia, though, has been effectively, a failed state for a long time. Somaliland, that is part of why they want to break away, because they've had law and order for a much longer time, whereas, Mogadishu and a lot of these other places in southern Somalia are still under total tribal clan, proto-ISIS, Boko Haram type rules. So it's a very unfortunate situation down there. But we also, of course, have some developments regarding the Turkish situation. They're projecting power, of course, not just in Somalia, but also in the Caucasus in their own backyard. They are, influencing the situation in Azerbaijan and Armenia. Huge protests, again, still led by bishops and these other figures against Pashinyan, who's making all sorts of ridiculous comments. They're about to sign a peace treaty, supposedly. They believe that he's going to completely revoke all of Armenia's claims on Azeri territory. Who knows what other concessions that will come out to and ultimately mean. But ultimately, the Armenians, I don't know when they're going to call for elections or anything like that, but between that going on and the Israel situation, Azerbaijan is really is really coming out on top despite all the other actors in these situations. Losing territory, at least Israel, they're in the geopolitical hot seat because of their, committing genocide. Azerbaijan is just getting away with theirs because it's much lower scale, a little bit less graphic and violent, less flashy. So they can kind of just slowly do what they're doing in Artsakh, which is, very unfortunate to see, but there's much less of an audience for what's going on there than for what's going on in Gaza. But the only other situation is what's going on in Georgia. But I did also briefly want to mention, because we're going to mention the U.S. situation later, but the U.S. intervening there. We have Armenia getting French weapons now being sold. The U.S., their person that they have appointed to negotiate between Israel and Lebanon is Amos Hochstein, who is a former IDF soldier and dual citizen of Israel. So that shows you the level with which the U.S. is, really taking negotiations seriously and trying to appease both sides, and definitely not just acting solely in the interest of the Jewish state. But France also acting in the interest of peace, selling these Caesar missiles and whatnot to Armenia, which Maria Zakharova and other Russian officials accused them of stoking another conflict in the region. So the dialectic has been created. It's France and Armenia versus Russia and Azerbaijan, Belarus and Azerbaijan, which, a little bit disappointing, but either way, you can't blame him because Pashinyan, again, he left the CSTO. That's kind of like if Hungary left NATO, I think we know what would happen. They'd be in the hot seat pretty quickly from their NATO neighbors. So if they want to take the CSTO seriously, Russia, Belarus, these other countries, then they kind of have to respond in kind. But Georgia, they're also doing some great things. We lost Armenia, as they say, the Russosphere, but Georgia seems to be coming back into the fold, talking about reopening their embassy in Russia. Obviously, that's a huge deal because, for a long, long time, since 2008 and the war and everything, they have suspended diplomatic relations over the issues of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And now they're also talking about pursuing these anti-LGBT, anti-trans bills. I think they're passing a bill that will totally ban, transgender operations and surgery, probably also the hormonal treatments. There's also the adoption of a Russian-style anti-LGBT propaganda bill, so no gay flags, no gay stuff in children's television, which is great to see from the Georgians, and we're glad to have them back on the right side of things, no longer in the Atlantic wing, as the Atlanticist movement, far, far away from the Atlantic, all the way into the Caspian, past the Black Sea towards the Caspian. How could they get that much influence? But it appears that some of it is being clawed back. But yeah, Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say on those multitude of issues, which I'm sure you do, we could probably also start talking about Russia, Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it ties in nicely because when we talk about this Turkic belt and the potential of the new CSTO, the rumor appeared this week, and I only call it a rumor because until we have more news, I think it's not really worthy of speaking about. But I think on a theoretical level, allegedly Kazakhstan, in some secret communiques, proposed to create a Turkic only version of a CSTO, essentially a security treaty organization similar to a NATO, including itself Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan as well, and naturally Turkey, Azerbaijan involved as well, which is absolutely what we've been discussing recently. And it seems as if they've been watching World War now, and finally Takayev himself has been tuning into some of our episodes, and he's like, "Yeah, that sounds like not a bad idea." Especially it gets him out of that predicament of being this in between country between two essentially superpowers, Russia and China. And we do recall those news, Conrad, from 2023 when Kazakhstan was turning underground car parks into like underground bunkers and building like Mount Weather type underground facilities in some of its really rare mountainous areas. So Kazakhstan is preparing for something in the long term, just as European countries are, preparing legislation to again begin conscriptions, drafts, mandatory military service. I think everybody sees what is looming on the horizon. They're not announcing mobilizations, but I think even a country like Kazakhstan, which is relatively peaceful, is also preparing for stuff. And what else? There's another sort of contribution to that in the news. A really popular Kazakh YouTuber was actually shot in Kiev I believe it was 1 or 2 days ago. It was, I think, Wednesday. Aidos Sadikov, he's a major, like probably the biggest opposition member, like a Kazakh Navalny, was shot in outside of his home in Kiev. It's interesting how all these oppositionary members, they all travel to Kiev and all these Western supported NATO places. Like we do know, like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Alexei Navalny, where these sort of people hail from, where they receive their support in Bitcoin payments from. I'm not saying anything bad against Bitcoin, but it's just we do understand where these paychecks, which avenue they utilize. So again, very curious. So who shot him? We're just not sure at the moment. He's hospitalized, so he's recovering. Super popular guy, potentially an oppositionary member to Tokayev. And Tokayev, we know, is a really diplomatic Kazakh leader. He can speak Mandarin fluently. So when Xi Jinping, every time he visits Kazakhstan, him and Tokayev speak fluently in Chinese, and which I think is really scary for some of the other people who try to communicate with Xi Jinping. Who was a very intellectual guy, and he loves European culture. Whenever Xi Jinping allegedly travels to Europe, he talks about like the Inquisition, the Renaissance, like various moments in European history, which even European presidents, prime ministers have no idea about. So like he talks about like pogroms, things like that, and European presidents like, sorry man, I didn't focus on that stuff in school, and so Xi Jinping is highly surprised. But so he's a very intellectual man, and so. The Turkic alliance, Conrad, will it happen? I'm not too sure. But if it does go down, we do know that most likely that Turkey is probably the primary actor behind all of it, and it will be the leader at the helm again. And the French opposition to Turkey over the years developing in Armenia and Georgia, I think, is simply the French trying to play a multi-angled game here. Macron, I think it's even beyond Macron. I think even if Marine Le Pen was the president of France, she would be acting in a similar fashion, expanding French influence in both Armenia and Georgia. I don't see this as necessarily a negative thing. Probably some local Armenians see this as like a blessing in disguise. And again, on our recent A for Hour episode discussing President Lukashenko of Belarus, we do talk about that deal with Azerbaijan, with the Aliyev clan, and Lukashenko's, I guess, sale of weapons to these Caucasian states over the last 2 decades or so. It's really a normal thing, but for sort of all those details, I recommend watching that episode because we do discuss Belarusian domestic as well as its geopolitical status, and I would say even cultural status in relation to them boys and the Ashkenazi population of Minsk. I think it's really curious, all those details. So check that episode out. But in terms of Ukraine, Russia, I think, Conrad, everything really goes back to that particular area because as we spoke about, the funding of Israel depends on it, the reaction of Turkey to all of these international news as well. So Turkey is very much still focusing on allowing that Russia-Ukraine grain deal to develop further. They really want shipments to continue, and it doesn't look like, at least not yet, right? Things haven't escalated to the point of Turkey actually closing the Bosphorus Straits at this point yet, but we also always know that the threat is looming. The Russian expedition in Syria is always at risk of being isolated and destroyed in the Mediterranean. As crazy as that sounds, this has been predicted not by us, but by people like Igor Strelkov and other Russian political commentators years ago. So we're always looking at that particular region in the Mediterranean. We do know that any mistakes or even, shall we say, correct actions from their perspective by these various major state actors such as Turkey, Syria, Israel could spawn what could develop into a very hot World War III scenario. So we're always kind of looking there. But in terms of Ukraine, Conrad, I mean, the biggest news has been that triple, do we call it a triple summit? We'll talk about the two major events, which is the Switzerland Peace Summit as well as the G7, sort of the outcomes of that, the rejected Russian peace deal. These are all very kind of predictable events. So nothing surprising really came of this, except for some of the parties in the Switzerland peace deal, which didn't sign onto the agreement. I think some of the countries surprised me personally, because Rwanda, for example, and we know Africa is like really loyal to that Russian relationship. Not a single African country sanctioned Russia, by the way, which is, shall we say, based. Perhaps they're looking to ally themselves to the Third Rome in the future. And we do know Orthodox evangelism is working overtime in Africa. So perhaps Africa is really waking up to some of these geopolitical realities. But Rwanda did not sign the peace agreement. A country like Iraq, which was literally occupied and still is, Conrad, occupied by US bases to this day, first signed it and then retracted. And countries again like Saudi Arabia, South Africa, did not sign the peace treaty, and India too, mind you. India, which has been trading illegally. By illegally, I mean it broke its own sort of deals that it struck with like these international globalist powers, that it will not be purchasing Russian oil, shall we say, over a certain price. Meanwhile, they have been purchasing crude oil for the last 2 years over $60 a barrel or whatever the deal was. $60 a barrel. So India has been trading with Russia this entire time, and suddenly at this major peace deal, it does not sign this faulty document, right, alongside some of these other Western countries, which I think is really good because when we speak about India, we always like to mention the fact that it's the most populous country, as well as it really doesn't have a determined allegiance, right? It's really in between. It's not friendly with China. It is a foundational BRICS country, and it is quite a fair distance away from Russia. So it is in a bizarre place. And again, US influence in India, they've always been trying to at least bring the Indians over to the first world, sort of the white man's land, back to, I guess, being a fiefdom of the British Empire, shall we say, in a conspirological sense, right? So super positive development, I think, overall, that a lot of countries have rejected the faulty peace deal. And the G7 was basically a NATO summit, which took place literally that same weekend.
But yeah, of course the Switzerland Ukraine conference, the 2-day peace conference where the other party involved, Russia, was not invited, so pretty much a non-starter from day one. But like Dimitri said, Rwanda pulling out after initially signing on. I believe it was what, 80, 91 or so countries were initially invited. 70 or so signed on, and some characters like Dimitri mentioned didn't sign on. Mexico, Colombia, South Africa. Of course, some of the most obvious countries that wouldn't sign on weren't even invited, like the Chinese weren't even they weren't even properly involved in the situation, even though the peace deal was ultimately ripped from part of the Chinese proposed peace deal, but ultimately it addresses none of the relevant issues that are going to be needed to sign peace. And this, of course, we mentioned last week, Putin's proposal that was then rejected. Of course, that proposal was, if somehow accepted, would have actually been pretty disappointing to pretty much any Russian nationalist, of course, losing any possibility of, gaining Kharkov or Odessa or anything like this, or even other parts of the region that are potentially considered the Donbass, right on the border with Donetsk and Luhansk. This is something that clearly he was outlining, the worst situation that they were willing to completely take after all of this warfare. And that was rejected. So now they're going to decapitate the snake. I don't know what your thoughts are, Dmitry, on the potential regime change situation in Ukraine. We've seen more Yanukovych appearing in public, so there's a lot of speculation there. But you already also mentioned our Lukashenko episode, which I think is a must listen for everybody. But all of these characters, Putin's already obviously doing his rounds in Asia, but Yanukovych, Lukashenko, even the Georgians, the Georgian Dream Party, these characters on the periphery of the Russosphere, they're coming into line. We see the Fab 3000s being deployed in Ukraine as the Russians continue to make huge gains. We've been posting about the gains made towards Chasiv Yar, which is going to fall to Russia soon. All sorts of other villages in Zaporozhye, Lugansk, Donetsk. The Sumy region also has seen some gains and whatnot. So it's very much active, and Russia has no need to accept some silly deal that would go against what it needs right now because it is enforcing the situation on the ground, as we speak. So that is obviously what they are going to do. And of course, we talked about last week the lifting of the weapons ban on Azov and these other associated militias, so they'll be operating with U.S. weapons. And of course, I believe ATACMS and HIMARS and other weapons are also authorized for use on Belgorod and these other regions of Russia that have never been claimed by the fake nation of Ukraine. So these are huge escalations that I don't think the Russians have any interest in surrendering to or negotiating with properly. I think at this point it's all or nothing. But yeah, Dmitry, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the potential for regime change in this situation as we see in this post Switzerland, post Putin's proposal, all of these things. Like what is the likelihood of the Zelensky regime surviving? What are some likely replacements? I'm curious.
Well, I think Zelensky's regime, it appears to me, will only last as long as the Joseph Biden presidency. So I do believe when Trump comes to power, one of his solutions, one of his deals that he will most likely propose to President Putin would be to get rid of Zelensky and perhaps even the entire Zelensky administration and bring in some sort of fresh people, maybe even mutually agreed upon candidates to run the Ukrainian administration. I think Trump will do that in order to focus more on his China situation in Taiwan, and of course Israel, which he's a big supporter of, which we just spoke about regarding MBS and Israel, Netanyahu, and Trump's sort of policies there. I think are very clear going forward. I think they're very predictable. So again, I think Trump would be very happy to stop the entire Ukraine operation, and also come out as a weird. Maybe he'll even win the Nobel Peace Prize for it. Right? Who knows? But I do think Zelensky's days are numbered in terms of after January, after even perhaps the November, once we get the initial results back, it'll be quite clear that Zelensky might receive the KIA. And I'm not talking about the car action. For some reason, the Russians don't really bomb any location that Zelensky travels to on the front, literally on the front lines. But perhaps those particular defenses will be lifted, and Zelensky will once again become vulnerable, like he was allegedly in the earlier weeks of the SMO in February of 2022. But Zelensky's appearance at the Swiss conference, Conrad, really does show us exactly who his handler is. And so we spoke about the APAC handlers 2 weeks ago, and we see actually firsthand who the actual handler of Zelensky is, and it has become very clear he really isn't undebated anymore, and that person is Andrei Yermak. Now, we've mentioned him in passing in past episodes, but not really focused on this figure. So, ethnically speaking, he's an Ashkenazi. He's from that particular family group, similar to Zelensky himself, which again shouldn't really surprise us because they are such a small minority in Ukraine. So why wouldn't he be the head of the office of the president of Ukraine and this unelected figure in a grey cardinal type role? He's had conflicts with Zelensky before. He's been a friend of Zelensky since his comedy days, so he knows Zelensky from back in the day. He supported Zelensky during his election campaign of 2019, and he's a sort of a staunch member of the Zelensky camp. What's curious is Andrei Yermak has very, very close connections to, shall we say, the rabbinical Hasidic community, but also Judeo-Masonic type communities around the world. And I did hear certain Russian commentators say, "Oh, what's the big deal? Like these rabbis, what's the point of speaking to them? Why does Putin meet them? Why do various Eastern European leaders meet these rabbis all the time?" Well, because the rabbis, perhaps they don't trade weapons directly, but they control the money flows. They are also the spiritual leaders of the bankers, of these massive banking families which rule the financial system of the world. These massive international banks situated in Europe, these Swiss banks, of course, various derivatives of the Rothschild family banks. And naturally, this is where all the money comes from. So you do need to, well, you don't need to, but the leaders of these various countries do communicate with the rabbis directly in order to have a direct line to the Rothschilds. And so we see Andrei Yermak in October, actually, he met with the local rabbis of Ukraine and he keeps saying these very verbose and hyperbolic statements, Conrad, such as, well, Ukraine and Israel are allies forever. We are one country, things like this, like absolutely, New Heavenly Jerusalem level rhetoric. Very curious. And on the 14th of November, he traveled to New York where he met all the top rabbis of New York, as well as the heads of B'nai B'rith, that 19th century Judeo-Masonic organization, a very early Zionist, very mysterious secret society, essentially, which really brings around all kinds of various conspiracy theories in our heads. But we literally have one of the most important unelected members of the Ukrainian government making it absolutely his most important deal to meet with top rabbis all over Ukraine, not with Orthodox leaders, but with this very, very small minority, despite the fact that Ukraine is 50% plus Orthodox Christian. So very curious as to why he decides to do this. And I only say this because in the middle of June of this year, again, he met with all the rabbis of Ukraine and he announced that, they will be standing strong for Ukraine, etc. So he's either Zelensky's middleman, or perhaps, as certain Russian commentators have already said, he is the real president of Ukraine, Andrei Yermak, literally another person of that community, and he's a big dude. Like, you can see him which is curious, he actually made it, and it wasn't a photo bomb. I think the world leaders know who this guy is. They're like, okay, he's this whatever Judeo-Masonic type figure. He's standing there next to the president or the prime minister of Switzerland in front of literally mogging Kamala Harris, who only, I think, came to the summit for like one day in order to pledge $1.5 billion to Ukrainian infrastructure. He's mogging Kamala Harris. He's actually mogging everybody. He's the biggest dude on the stage. Zelensky looks tiny next to him, and he's wearing, again, like what looks like a Top Gun type military aviation uniform, so completely underdressed, but still not giving a damn. This Andrei Yermak guy, very, very scary, bizarre character, which I think we should be paying attention to, because who knows, maybe he'll end up being the next president of Ukraine once Zelensky's done with, perhaps. Who knows? But yes, this peace deal was it was in complete shambles, Conrad. I think the bizarre thing is, I think it was the referendum on Zelensky's legitimacy post the absence of the May election, which took place in Ukraine. So Zelensky appearing amongst all these world leaders essentially shows that they admit that he is the legitimate president of Ukraine, despite the fact that, constitutionally speaking, according to the Ukrainian constitution, he isn't the president anymore. So Ukraine, again, is just a weird anti-legal sort of not really legislative state, but we all know it's not like we support various constitutions anyway. I mean, we understand these are all Masonic documents to begin with. But of course, what did the peace treaty even talk about? It spoke about, of course, the protecting the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant because nuclear power is so dangerous. It spoke about the free flow of Ukrainian agricultural products, all that grain we spoke about. Allegedly, Russia has been interfering in these shipments, which is a lie. And the third thing was the return of 20,000 children, which we know these people that rule Ukraine, they care about the children so much. And these 20,000 Ukrainian children who are being kept in Russian prisons somewhere in Siberia, apparently, and need to be returned back to Ukraine. And I have to ask, for what purpose? Because I doubt it's to be placed into caring Ukrainian families. We all know how foster homes work in Europe. We all know about the German foster home experiments. I recommend people do their own research. So, very interesting proposals. And again, Russia not invited. This thing was a complete sham, a failure, and these world leaders look like clowns standing there all together, pretending that this was an important event. And the ecumenical patriarch, of course, attending the G7 summit and this peace summit jointly, again, only brings shame to his local church and the seat of the what by honor should be the first seat of the Orthodox Christian Church. Very unfortunate.
Yeah, really sad. They're really stretching the definition of a state. Jim Jatras was on the Duran, our good buddy. He was talking about this, how, they've got the EU signing on at three different times on the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. So they're stretching the signatures there. They've got the EP signing on it, which, unlike the Vatican, is not a sovereign state in and of itself. So not sure what its signature exactly means. It's really is just a bunch of guys in an old neighborhood in Turkey. But, I still respect it. I'm still in communion with the EP as an Antiochian, but that's still just really what's going on over there. But you mentioned Yermak. Maybe he will be the president of the New Heavenly Jerusalem. If that's how this is all going to go down, I hope not. But anything is possible at this point. But they still are trying to assault Crimea. Though we're seeing more German and Western European maps conceding the reality that Crimea is in fact Russian and it's really never coming back. But you mentioned Zelensky, parading around in front of all these world leaders. Biden obviously embarrassed himself. I'm sure everybody's seen him wandering around and all of that nonsense. But Putin is, making his own diplomatic missions abroad, of course. He was just in North Korea. We posted videos of him in the only Orthodox church in Pyongyang. He was being shown around by the Moscow Patriarchate Bishop of the Far East over there. Obviously, he's not the Bishop of Japan, that's Metropolitan Seraphim, but this bishop, he's in Korea, South Korea, North Korea, I believe, Taiwan and Singapore as well. Not 100% sure, but he was there. There were North Korean people chanting as well, which is, quite beautiful. And they obviously signed an entire defense agreement. I believe, as far as I'm aware, the agreement between Moscow and Pyongyang that they signed, the defense agreement is a NATO-esque defense alliance, basically, where if Russia proper is invaded by any external enemy, on the ground, North Korean troops will be there. And the same thing, of course, would go for if North Korean sovereignty is threatened. So, really big developments between Russia and North Korea, which I've always found it funny that North Korea, of course, are the biggest foreign ammunition providers to Russia. And for most of the war, at least South Korea has been the largest ammunition providers to Ukraine. So it's a bit of a plot twist. This whole thing has been a Korean proxy war. That's who's, the JQ, it's more about the KQ at this point. And no, I don't mean the slur. I mean the Korean question, right? Maybe they're the ones really, really pulling the strings. But I jest, of course. But the situation in Taiwan is obviously developing a certain way, but as are the other countries that are on the South China Sea, or I guess they would call it something else. But China's been getting in its disputes with the Philippines and Vietnam. But Putin's trip after going to North Korea, he also paid a visit to Vietnam, which is, of course, not surprising. Vietnam is closer with China and Russia after, of course, winning the Vietnam War. They've maintained, the multipolar sphere of influence as opposed to becoming part of the U.S.-led world order. But it's interesting that Putin is there. Maybe he'll be smoothing over some issues because China, they have recently been having some disputes with Vietnam. Vietnam called them out for doing some surveying on their far northern plateau. Of course, they have a border with China. And I guess much like China is sort of using its Coast Guard and going into these Thomas Shoals and these northern, these random regions that are technically occupied by the Philippines. So too, I guess, are they doing some land surveying? Maybe they have some plans for, maybe it's just business plans that want to make deals and contracts with Vietnamese businesses and, contractors in the state. But, maybe they've got some other plans. I don't know. I know that China wants to reconstruct with Taiwan, and there was a report. We don't know if it's accurate or not that Xi Jinping did tell Ursula von der Leyen that he didn't want to be pulled into a war that the U.S. is trying to goad him into. Of course, last week we discussed the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command talking about, totally mining and dominating the Taiwan Straits with these unmanned nautical vehicles and whatnot. But yeah, the situation in the Far East, Putin is, keeping his friends, making sure that those that have been loyal to him know that, they're in his good graces and whatnot. And maybe some big things are planned with China, Russia, and Vietnam. Obviously, Vietnam, over 100 million people, so a huge manufacturing powerhouse and just in general a powerhouse. They're going to enter some of the top most populous countries at this point. So, very interesting developments indeed. Dimitri, you may have some updates specifically on the Philippine situation, unless you have other comments.
Oh no, absolutely. I think the Philippines, it's good that we've been speaking about it for a few weeks because the situation keeps developing. So at this point in June this week, I would say the most provocative incident we've seen thus far has taken place. So we had 8 Chinese Coast Guard motorboats, and these are very, very small motorboats, maybe like 5 or 6 personnel. They looked pretty crowded, actually. They approached at full speed, surrounded 2 Filipino naval vessels, and these vessels are quite small. These are essentially inflatable boats, but quite large ones. As you can imagine, they have electronics on board, well developed. They even had arms on board. They had, I believe, 8 M4 rifles. They had various supplies, food, electronics, things which they were taking to the second Thomas Shoal, or perhaps the Scarborough Shoal located nearby, which these two shoals are sort of these weird semi-island reef type of formations, which we spoke about, which essentially now we have the Philippines and China arguing over. And so these two naval vessels were essentially taking these supplies, including the M4 rifles, to this particular location. The Chinese Coast Guard, intercepted them, surrounded them, rammed the 2 Filipino boats. The accident, of course, destroyed a lot of the electronics on board. Then they seized the M4 rifles. Funny enough, they started attacking the Filipino naval officers with, beating them. They had machetes, things like that. So there was a confrontation, and nobody died, but a Filipino naval officer lost his thumb. So apparently was cut off by a Chinese machete. So that, I mean, look, the Filipinos described this as an act of piracy on the South China Sea, which it sounds like, for whatever reason, I think the way China views the Philippines, Conrad, it's not because they disrespect the Philippines. I think they see it as it really is. No rose-colored glasses. I think they do see the Filipino Navy as a derivative of the U.S. Navy, essentially, as an auxiliary force, which is why every time they see Filipino naval vessels moving into this, I suppose you can say international waters or maybe disputed territories, they see this as a potential act of aggression or some sort of geopolitical strategic move, and so hence they act kind of sporadically. And we did speak about the Filipino Navy, I believe, a week or two ago when we discussed the details that the Filipino Navy is quite large, but so is even the basic Chinese Coast Guard Navy, which is almost closing in at 100 massive vessels, and that's the largest Coast Guard naval fleet in the entire world, which is curious because China isn't entirely like a sort of naval power. I would say it's more like a land/naval power, like a mixed hybrid version, unlike the US, which is predominantly a naval power. So this really interesting development. The Filipino president has been, of course, using it as he said, we need to publish the footage of this attack because it will really show Chinese aggression. China needs to return the 8 M4 rifles that they've seized. There's a sort of arguing about the return of equipment. China's not commenting on this at all. They're basically saying that, this is an arms deal of some sort. Like, they shouldn't be transporting weapons. And I just want to say the constraint of the Filipino naval officers not using the M4 rifles on these approaching Coast Guard vessels, I think, is really, probably a good testament towards the Filipino naval officers, if anything, right? So yeah, China's basically at this moment, Conrad, almost claiming the entire South China Sea. But this plays into Putin's visit to Vietnam and the recent collaboration between the Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who, Malaysia is a Muslim country. It's situated on one peninsula and another island, which is attached to Indonesia. So Malaysia is essentially split into these two parts. I guess geographically speaking, if you look at a map, and naturally Malaysia is also adjacent to Singapore, Singapore is in the vicinity of those Commonwealth post-British imperial states. Famously, if you recall the Japanese siege of Singapore during World War II, Singapore's always been this strange sort of British colonial, and we know British means Rothschilds, means, naval, US naval relation, means NATO as well. So the relationship between Malaysia and China closening, because the Prime Minister of Malaysia meets with Xi Jinping. They confirmed that Malaysia will most likely be accepted into BRICS next year in 2025. It's a huge move. And the reason why Malaysia is important in this particular discussion of the South China Sea is because the South China Sea essentially has 4 major players, Besides Indonesia, which is slightly involved here, we have Vietnam, which Putin recently visited, and with President To Lam, they discussed the increase in trade. Apparently, Russian trade with Vietnam has risen by 33% in recent years since the SMO, and they signed more than 12 various trade agreements. So Putin's visit to Vietnam has been very, very fruitful. And we know Putin most likely is also bringing perhaps a covert message alongside, from China, from Xi Jinping, which would, Vietnam is also like you can say, a post-communist country in a way, transitioning to a more capitalistic type of state. But it's very curious because Vietnam is one of the only countries, Conrad, who has defeated both the U.S. and China in previous wars in the last century. Which, the war with China was quite short, but Vietnam did win that. And again, the Vietnam War, famously of the U.S., which the U.S. frankly lost because of its internal domestic policies, but still was quite, I think, traumatic and destructive for both countries. And so Vietnam is quite a giga Chad state if you think about it. And Putin meeting up with To Lam is almost as powerful as his meeting with Kim Jong Un. So again, the other country, of course, being Philippines. So we have Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, China. These four are the claimants of this South China Sea area. And I think as we move forward, the only country really with close US/NATO ties in the Pacific is the Philippines. And of course, we mention Taiwan all the time, but Taiwan, as you said, Conrad, there are always, the papers that coming out of Washington, they do confirm that in all the analysis papers coming out of Washington, the sort of conclusions are that Taiwan, if China was to enact the sort of strategy of conquest, it would be surrounded completely. So the only thing Taiwan can do is really increase the losses of China and make itself less of a, shall we say, a tasty prize for the Chinese regime, especially if it was surrounded, which is why, as you said, they employ these really deep mining strategies and they will deploy very quick acting mines along the sea areas and what they call the porcupine strategy. Very curious. So essentially, they'll have spines coming out of Taiwan, stopping the Chinese surround from taking place. So I think given all of this, we do see China clearly expanding, being given the green light by its neighbors such as Vietnam. Putin's relation with Vietnam recently, his discussion, I think, is also one of the great benefits for this freeway relationship there. And the Malaysian push into BRICS, I think, really says a lot that the only really country that disagrees with China in the South China Sea is the Philippines. So unfortunately, the spotlight is on the Philippines, and it doesn't look like the Filipino foreign policy is very independent, unfortunately, due to their status as a semi-U.S. colony in a South Korea-like, Taiwanese-like state.
No, it's big things coming in the South China Sea and Taiwan between Japan and everybody. Of course, I've heard some news of some big potential financial collapses coming from Japan, which is one of the largest holders of U.S. treasuries. And, perhaps if certain things go that direction and Japan sees itself as needing to be called upon by the U.S. to defend Taiwan, maybe if they go through some economic pain, they may abandon that. And the U.S. would then see that they don't have their, big aircraft carrier of Japan over there and might realize it's not worth it because we know that China on a long enough timeline wins with Taiwanese integration because the Navy is rapidly outpacing their shipbuilding capacities are dramatically pacing the United States. So eventually it would be for the U.S. So that's why the U.S. is ultimately trying to provoke China, to engage and start this themselves when they have the sort of the energy behind them for a war. And then they will, they would then fight that as, the best time for them to fight it is today because each day it goes by, China gets a little bit stronger. But, we got to move on a little bit to talk about a really important issue. Of course, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, June 30th, they are holding their elections for their new patriarch as Patriarch Neophyte reposed, and they have now narrowed. We read the long list of candidates last week, and now the list has narrowed to 3 candidates, and thankfully the odds have increased for a canonical. They have narrowed to 3 candidates for this patriarchal election, and they are as follows. Of course, they are Gregory of Vratsa, Daniel of Vidin, and Gabriel of Lovchan. And of course, this is 2 out of 3 of these bishops are in favor of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They are against the schismatics. The only one in favor is Gregory of Vratsa. And frankly, I mentioned this to Dmitry off air. If you just done a physiognomy check on all of these guys, I could have told you which one was in favor of the schismatics without even knowing, you know what I'm saying? So, we can have the pictures linked at some point, or rather they're shared on the World War Now Twitter pages. But this is really important because if Bulgaria goes the way of the schismatics, that that runs an extreme risk of them getting caught up in some kind of Nicaea 2025 nonsense and being on the very ugly wrong side of a unfortunate schism that we fear is brewing in the church right now. And of course, it would just be horrible. There are Bulgarian churches in the U.S. I have friends that attend Bulgarian Orthodox churches that are in the USA under Metropolitan Joseph, who we had mentioned on the previous episode. So it would be horrible for them to suddenly be in communion with these nonsensical schismatics who, again, as far as the Orthodox world is concerned, are just defrocked laymen. But this is positive, 2/3 chance. I have a strong feeling that either Daniel or Gabriel will ultimately prevail in this election, so be sure to pray for that. But it's very fortunate that now the odds have narrowed in this capacity, because Bulgaria, again, that's a Balkan nation, an old calendar Orthodox nation. That would be extremely. Or wait, are they on the old calendar? Maybe they are on the new calendar. I can't remember, but I could have sworn they were on the old. But either way, Bulgaria, an old ancient Orthodox patriarchate. It would be really unfortunate to see them also fall to this schismatic nonsense. But Dimitri, I don't know if you have any other church updates for us.
Yeah, I think completely agree, because schismatic nonsense essentially means not acknowledging properly and not really calling out the persecution taking place in Ukraine, which we on the show make sure to mention, at least every week we mention and update you guys as to what's taking place in that particular realm. I think it's important, given that the lack of attention it's getting in mainstream media is, of course, quite stunning and striking. Now, the long-suffering Metropolitan Jonathan of Tulchin. Tulchin is located next to Uman, so that's basically central western Ukraine, a very, shall we say, liberal slash Jewish heavy area. It's a very small town, but Metropolitan Jonathan, on the 18th of June, the appeals court has upheld his sentence of 5 years imprisonment and the confiscation of all of his personal effects due to his support of Russia during the SMO, which again is preposterous. So Metropolitan Jonathan will remain imprisoned for another 3.5 years or so. Perhaps they will extend it. Who knows? These people are absolutely unpredictable, and the unpredictability factor comes out because on the 12th of June, Metropolitan Jonathan, actually, the appeals court offered him to plea as a member of the Russian military, or as somebody who assisted the Russian military, and perhaps he would be exchanged in a military exchange with the Russian side for Ukrainian prisoners. Of course, this is absurd because the Metropolitan Jonathan is not a member of the Russian military, nor even a rebel or a volunteer or anything of that sort, which the Ukrainians label these various people within their own country as. But notice that Metropolitan Jonathan, of course, declines this, and he also states that he wants to remain and work towards improving orthodoxy in Ukraine and work with his flock, which unfortunately I'm not sure if that would even be possible, because his flock may be in anti-Orthodox concentration camps, gulags, and possibly even completely destroyed by the time he comes out of prison in 3.5 or 4 years' time. So really negative all around, and naturally these sort of signing of plea deals and the signing of a plea deal of this sort would essentially label a metropolitan of the Orthodox Church as a member of the Russian military, which in and of itself is almost like a plea of guilt, and it would be a lie on paper as well. So of course a bishop of the church cannot do that. There's also the question of his private property, which, if you think about it, a monastic, could he even have private property? And if it is private, is it his, or does it belong to the diocese? What we have is the Ukrainian government essentially, through the courts, seizing the belongings of an Orthodox Christian diocese from the diocese itself, which is, again, criminal and absurd in terms of church history. It's not surprising, but it is another chapter of persecution. A similar thing, of course, we had Jan Taksur, of course, give his summary of the 11th of June Council of Churches, which took place just before the Peace Summit and just before G7. And this was an ecumenist type of gathering of Ukrainian church members, Protestants, Catholics, various Ukrainian schismatic sects, as well as, unfortunately, Bishop Clement of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and his right-hand man, a priest monk. And so Bishop Clement allegedly had the blessing of Metropolitan Onufri to attend this ecumenist conference, but I think they were hoping to at least voice some of their concerns about the persecution. But what took place was that, unfortunately, the outcome, the conclusive statement of that church conference on the 11th of June was, as absurd as it sounds, Conrad, is that Ukraine is a free, liberal, democratic country that respects all of its religions. Like, it was something like a 2-3 sentence paragraph which they released as the conclusive. This was the summary of the meeting that all the members agreed to. And what this shows, I mean, this is similar to when during the 1930s late 1920s, when Metropolitan Sergius Starogorodsky stated to the whole world that there was no persecution in the USSR. This is the beginning of Surgeonism, by the way. Whilst priests, bishops were languishing in prisons, being shot, etc. I mean, this is quite horrible. I think if you imagine this conference being of a similar effect, essentially on the 11th of June, the proclamation by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that there is no persecution taking place to the world public, it also paints the recent, bringing up the issue of persecution to the UN as somewhat of a wasted effort. Anyways, it's entirely negative. Ecumenism is always tied to liberalism and the demonic, so it doesn't surprise me that the outcomes were similar to this. In terms of other similar news, we did see Chasiv Yar, we mentioned earlier, huge combat action being taken there. The Russian forces are essentially located right next to some of the Chasiv Yar building line, and we see on the drone footage released, which we published recently on one of our social media pages, the destroyed Saints Boris and Gleb church, absolutely demolished by Ukrainian, probably even Russian bombardment from range, because it is located in this no man's land location. I mean, it's just horrible seeing Orthodox churches, chapels, cathedrals beheaded with massive like holes in them. I mean, it's something like you imagine out of the 1930s, but here we are in the 2020s seeing it live. So there's some real concerns coming out of Ukraine. And notice that unfortunately this peace deal rejected that Putin did propose to the Ukraine. Although the peace deal was rejected, it didn't have a particular clause relating to the Orthodox Church persecution, which possibly if any other peace deal is struck in the future, maybe after massive Russian gains, perhaps they could include a clause that would grant the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, of course, that of Metropolitan Onufry or his successor, formal legitimacy in amongst the Ukrainian people, and even some sort of protections, because they definitely require that. Their property requires that, and we see all kinds of crazy stuff. Monasteries having to defend themselves, things like that. Yeah, it's very dramatic, and it's not really stopping. It's almost like every week there are these absolutely horrendous cases and updates that we need to sort of tell you guys about. But I think it's best to be informed rather than be surprised, because again, at this point, we can pray for Metropolitan Jonathan, as he is perhaps the most long-suffering hierarch of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church at this point.
No, I totally agree. We have to pray for Metropolitan Jonathan, the fact that he has been so persecuted. Obviously, Metropolitan Longin also persecuted, assaulted many times. Of course, Metropolitan Luke, house arrest. We could go down the list. It's really the fact that it isn't more international news, the fact that every Orthodox church is talking about it more. Of course, at my parish, we pray for the persecuted church in Ukraine and Metropolitan Onufry every Sunday, but it should be something talked about more. But of course, the entire Greek Orthodox world, it's only at Ephraimite monasteries and other good parishes where you're going to hear about anything like this. So it's really important to keep him in your prayers and to keep the entire church in your prayers. We've talked about the Church of the Tithes and these other places. These are real places where parishioners and Orthodox lay people used to go and gather that are no more, and those people are suffering. So unfortunate to see. But speaking of Bulgaria, Ukraine, the Orthodox regions in the east, we're going to go to the Balkans and talk about some of the Serbia stuff. Big things going on in the Serbian soccer football world, of course, since there was that big brawl where Serbian President Vucic's son was almost involved, and the Serbian versus English fans fighting the Serbs totally beat the crap out of the England fans. Not surprising per se. Eastern European ultras tend to be at the top of their game, but at other football games, the controversies have been there have been Albanians and Croatians chanting, die Serbs, kill the Serbs, and these other things, and the Serbs are trying to get, those people to be punished in the football federations and whatnot. And then at a recent game, the Albanians said something negative towards Macedonians, and that was because the new Macedonian government, the Serb Ivan Stojkovic, the president of the Democratic Party of Serbs, he will be a deputy prime minister and the minister in charge of relations between ethnic communities. Albanian politicians in North Macedonia are outraged with this decision. This is from Serb News. With Arbor Ademi, the vice president of the Albanian party, saying that the Ohrid agreement for the first time since 2001 is in the hands of Serbians of Putinist beliefs. So, North Macedonia is doing us proud, maintaining its frame in the multipolar sphere. Our good friend GSP, I'm sure he would be proud as a Macedonian to see them not zogging out. But Srpska also, they are moving forward again. They're still looking at preparing for their referendum on independence from Bosnia and Herzegovina. So again, it's the twilight years of Bosnia and Herzegovina here, everybody. So go get your passport stamped. It's not long for this world. So Again, we're also praying for the Serbian people there that controversy and violence can be avoided on these border regions. But unfortunately, it does look like I would wager that that sphere of the Balkans is going to get dragged into the Third World War, similar times to when, the Middle East and the Ukrainian front connect, because, we know where World War One started with the spark that started with the Black Masonic hand in killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand in, Austria-Hungary and Serbia. And then, of course, we see it today how that might not be the original spark. Of course, Ukraine has been raging, and then we have Israel, Iran, Lebanon, but it'll very much be a player because, in many ways, some could call the Balkan Wars of the 90s and 2000s, an early spark to this broader Third World War, much like you could say the same about Syria. So, not to get too deep here, we're basically finishing up the show right now. But yeah, we've got the Biden Trump debates coming up on June 27th, a little bit before the Bulgarian church elections. So, we're going to be following that pretty closely. But Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say, I'll probably do the plugs, but I'll hear your final remarks on the Third World War this week.
Yeah, only coincidentally, since we are speaking about Republika Srpska, on the 19th of June, it is the birthday of Radovan Karadzic, the former president of Republika Srpska, the first president, actually, of Republika Srpska. He's currently serving 40 years in prison on 11 counts of war crimes against humanity by The Hague. So he's like the proto-Putin of the Balkans, allegedly, free Radovan Karadzic. We don't recognize these particular crimes. Naturally, he called the court itself a NATO court, and this is what I think these people planned for Vladimir Putin, people like Igor Strelkov, Dmitry Medvedev, if they were to capture some of these Russian figures of power and take them to trial. Of course, we would see these sort of illegitimate Sanhedrins gather in Europe and sentence them to very, very long years of prison, right? So again, it's really inhumane, and Republika Srpska, I think, will stay loyal to its heritage as a Serbian superpower going forward. I think combined all of the Serbian, shall we say, fiefdoms, Montenegro, you have Macedonian, that particular alliance, Serbia itself, as well as the Republika Srpska, and you do have almost like a small empire of sorts, the Empire of Serbia, of course, reunited. And we say this when, the last piece of the puzzle also needs to be joined, and that is Kosovo. And Kosovo, unfortunately, Conrad did vote for the, as you would expect, voted for the Zelensky peace conference, of course, signing its name on as the biggest joke on that list, I would say. This, amidst all the other clown countries such as Andorra, which is the weird Catholic country of Macron being its co-prince with the Catholic bishop, and Andorra having legal gay marriage but completely illegal abortion, a nonsense sort of state right between Spain and France, really having nothing to do with Charlemagne or any of its predecessor princes and kings. Very bizarre sort of history there, but I think world history in and of itself is kind of unraveling before our eyes, which is what we're covering here in World War Now. And I think this week was one of the many very fully packed episodes, which I think will continue developing moving forward.
Yeah, again, we had more stuff we could have talked about, but we're filling up on time here. So again, leave a comment about some things that happened in World War III this week that maybe we missed. We'd love to hear from you guys. Be sure to check out our Lukashenko episode of Ether Hour this week, and you can find all of that on worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. That is our home base. Put your email in for free. You'll get every episode, free or paid, in your inbox. And then, of course, if you would like, you can support the show, get behind the paywall, and get access to the full lengths of all of the Ether Hour episodes. It's well over 40 episodes at this point, so that is hours and hours of premium content, stuff that we couldn't be saying publicly, really hard-hitting stuff, as well as just some of the most high-level content on some of these subjects that you're really ever going to find, deep research and whatnot. So thank you again so much for listening and supporting. But elsewhere, you can find us, of course, on Twitter, _. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, that's World War Now. Leave a comment there and subscribe. You should be subscribed on both the Substack and the YouTube. That's, of course, what the true fans do. We still use the YouTube for live streaming and whatnot, so it's a good place to be. Be sure to follow us on Rumble as well. It's a good backup, World War Now. Obviously, Telegram is super important, World War Now Telly. That's a great news feed, 24/7, all about the Third World War. We're keeping you posted. That's one of our main sources for when we do the show, so be sure to follow us there. Obviously, I'm on Twitter at GnomeRad. Dimitri is on Twitter at OCanonist. Again, World War Now _. We both run that account, so you get the best of both worlds. But worldwarnow.co, that's the World War Now Substack. That's our home base. Again, subscribe. Really helps us out. Thank you so much for listening to the very end. And with all of that, we will see you on the next Ether Hour or the next World War Now. So thank you again so much for listening, and God bless.